"Let's not make this about you, Lorna." That was my uncle's only greeting as I stepped through the hall doors. His eyes didn't meet mine. His voice didn't waver. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a joke. It was policy. The Hall of Honors was dressed like a monument. Flags hung like verdicts. The air smelled of starch and cold air conditioning. Rows of brass buttons and hard jawlines filled every seat with a purpose. Applause moved in rehearsed rhythm like a marching cadence. Everyone wore some shade of pride, and I wore gray, a wool coat. Neutral, nondescript, no name tag, no ribbons, no decoration to catch the light, just texture, just absence. Today wasn't about me. It was for Elia, my sister, their sunrise. She was being honored as the youngest female captain to lead logistics at Fort Griffin. Photos of her filled the big screen, her stance in Arctic snow, her salute at West Point, her command at convoy formation. Her voice played in the background, recorded during an after-action briefing. Steady, exact, heroic. I moved along the edge of the room, quiet steps on polished tile. I looked for a seat. Every row in front had names printed in clean, bold font. I scanned the back, found an untagged bench next to a janitor's cart and a box of crumpled programs. No one looked up. No one nodded. No one asked if I belonged. I didn't expect them to. I sat, adjusted the coat collar, let my shoulders sink into the shadows. Someone behind me whispered, "Who's that in the back?" Probably admin staff. I didn't turn, didn't flinch. Just tucked my hands deeper into my pockets. My fingers brushed cold metal, a flash drive, still sealed, still waiting. Not today. I kept my eyes on the screen, but I wasn't watching the slideshow. I was scanning faces, watching how their expressions rose with Elia's name, how their pride was public, polished, preset. At the front, my mother leaned toward Elia and fixed her collar. I noticed she wore the same pearl earrings I gave her a decade ago. The ones she once said were too elegant for a quiet daughter. I blinked slowly. Once, I wasn't proud. I wasn't jealous. I was measuring distance between the woman on the stage and the one they thought had vanished. I remembered the last time I stood in this hall. 18, eager, in uniform, back straight, mind sharp. They said I had presence, that I'd rise, that I'd command. But command was never enough, not if it didn't look like them, not if it questioned them. They said I cracked. I didn't. I walked away, signed the form, boarded a train, left without rage or regret, just silence. Today, they didn't speak of me, not even as footnote, not even in embarrassment. Because to them, I didn't fail, I ceased, but I had returned. Quiet, watching, listening, not for applause, not for closure, but for timing. They thought I was here out of guilt or sentiment. They were wrong. I came to observe, not the ceremony, not the speech, the break, the moment the script faltered. And somewhere inside this hall, behind polished podiums and gleaming boots, that moment was already approaching. I leaned back, let the lights dim, and waited. They called me undisciplined, said I couldn't handle structure, that I crumbled under pressure, that I lacked military temperament. The words came wrapped in formality, but the meaning was simple. She broke, she quit. That was the version they liked. Clean, convenient, not messy with questions like why or what really happened. Just a checkbox marked voluntary withdrawal and an empty seat at family dinners ever since. But I didn't leave because I couldn't take the heat. I left because I saw the fire wasn't real. Second year of officer candidacy. I had top scores, fluent in 2 dialects, a natural at situational command, but I asked too many questions, the kind that made instructors pause and glance at the closed doors. Why was our logistics protocol based on outdated conflict zones? Why were cadets being reassigned mid-training without explanation? Why were after-action reports signed before missions even began? No one answered directly, but the tension grew like mold under tile. One evening, I found my file had been flagged for attitude review. That same night, someone from Washington contacted me. Civilian email, no logo, no subject line, just coordinates and a date. One conversation later, everything I thought I knew about military structure dissolved into static. They weren't recruiting me for war. They were recruiting me for absence. I signed the withdrawal papers quietly the next week, smiled through the farewell. Let them write me off as another dropout. Let my father say, some people aren't built for command, without knowing I had just accepted one he would never even be cleared to hear about. I became a ghost in their stories. The older sister they skipped over during introductions. The one who almost made it. A cautionary tale, but I hadn't vanished. I just stopped being visible. While Elia trained under cameras and ceremonies, I trained in shadows and off-site compounds. No rank, no unit. Just code names, clearances, and silence. They trained me in languages first, then in silence, then in how to disappear without leaving a vacuum. I learned how to reroute surveillance grids in under 7 minutes, how to mimic chain of command speech from any branch, any country, how to plant a report that would get read, believed, then destroyed by morning. I wasn't absent, I was embedded, and I was watching everything they never thought I'd understand. Elia's face started showing up more often. Newsletters, defense blogs, family group chats I wasn't part of. Her medals piled up like praise I'd never received. I never resented her. But I did resent how my silence was mistaken for absence, how they rewrote me out of our story without asking if I was still writing my own. I kept tabs on her, quietly, watched every deployment log, monitored every logistic reshuffle she oversaw. Not out of jealousy, out of instinct, because I knew this family's pride always came with pressure. And pressure can crack people even when they smile through it. Last year, I left something small in her duffel bag. A sleek drive labeled with protein bar branding. A ping bait, not for spying, for safety. A safeguard only I could trace, just in case something went wrong, just in case someone reached her before I could. Because beneath all the silence and strategy, she was still my sister, and I wasn't done protecting her. The morning air at Fort Griffin tasted like dust and tension. Red dirt curled under every boot, and the wind moved in brief, apologetic gusts, just enough to stir flags and whisper secrets. I stood at the edge of the open training yard. Civilian clearance badge clipped to my coat. Tactical slacks, plain black windbreaker, no insignia, no signature, just presence. The cadets ran drills in near-perfect unison. Their cadence echoed between steel buildings like heartbeat and discipline had merged into one. I watched from a patch of shadow near the observation fence. Neutral, deliberate, blending into the kind of silence that made people forget you were there. That was always the point. Elia barked commands across the field, voice sharp as gravel on steel. Hold formation, left wheel, mark it, again. Her tone hadn't changed, still exact, still precise, still enough to make rookies sweat. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did, but chose not to, and that was fine. I wasn't here for a reunion, I was here for a reminder. Then it happened. A pause in the rhythm. Subtle, barely half a second. But trained eyes noticed cracks before civilians even registered dust. Sergeant Decker froze mid-stride. He was lean, scarred, the kind of man whose expression had calcified into one permanent scowl. I remembered his file. Former Black Ops logistics, reassigned after a tribunal no one ever publicly mentioned. His eyes locked onto mine across the yard, and stayed. 1 beat, 2, he didn't squint, didn't nod, just registered. Like a soldier realizing he'd stepped on something that wasn't dirt. Then he turned. Every boot in the yard stilled. Every whisper snapped shut. Decker marched toward me, precision steps, dust scattering at each heel. His presence cut the yard in half like a blade made of protocol. He stopped inches from me, saluted. Firm, formal, impeccable. Commander Arlen, ma'am, we weren't informed of your presence. The yard fell silent, not confused. Not offended, just stunned. My throat didn't move. My posture didn't shift, I answered simply. Observation only, off record. Carry on, Sergeant. Decker blinked once, then pivoted clean. Resuming phase 2 drills, he barked. But no one moved. The cadets looked at me like I had just rewritten the room. Some of them whispered. Commander. Did he say Arlen? Elia's hand faltered on her training baton. It struck the dirt with a hollow thud. Her jaw tensed. Her back straightened further, like posture alone could hold the moment together. I didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't correct them. I didn't need to. The myth of Lorna, the dropout, the failure, the one who vanished, had just collided with a truth none of them were prepared to admit existed. I let them look, not because I needed validation, but because sometimes silence needs to be seen. The message came at 3:27 p.m. No greeting, no warmth, no punctuation, family dinner. Sunday, come looking normal. No, how have you been? No, we're proud of you. Just orders. I stared at the screen for a long moment, not in surprise, in confirmation. This was always how they offered peace, not through apology, through expectation. I went, not for them. For Aaliyah. The driveway hadn't changed. Cracked at the edge like it always had been. My father used to call it a character flaw in the concrete, but never bothered to fix it. Said it built resilience every time you stepped wrong. The porch light blinked once. A soft flicker, indecisive like it couldn't decide if I belonged here or not. I stood outside longer than I needed to, listening to the faint noise from inside. Laughter, plates clinking. Someone said Elia's name and 3 people laughed at once. The warmth was there, but I wasn't part of it. Inside, everything looked curated. Cinnamon ham steaming on the center platter. Napkins starched so sharply they could cut skin. Wine glasses aligned like formation. Photos ran in a loop on the TV. Elia saluting. Elia receiving ribbons. Elia holding a logistics chart with a general's hand on her shoulder. Slide after slide. A legacy in slideshow. Not a single photo of me, not even from childhood. I stood near the entryway, coat still on. No one noticed. Or maybe they did and pretended otherwise. My mother passed by once, looked at me like a coat rack, then glanced toward the dining room. My father sat at the head of the table, upright, fork and knife placed neatly, untouched. His eyes were fixed on the screen. On Elia, not once did they shift in my direction. So what are you doing now? He said it without turning, as if he'd been waiting to ask, but not to hear the answer. Before I could respond, Aunt Liesel piped in from across the room. She used to be a hostess. Remember, maybe she's back in food service. Laughter bubbled. Not cruel, just comfortable. The kind of comfortable that assumes you never changed. I smiled, just enough to keep the room quiet. I still serve. I said, just in quieter rooms. No one asked what that meant. No one followed up. And that was fine. This family never chased details. They chased image. I drifted toward the table. The seats were full. Every chair labeled with names in cursive cardstock, not one with mine. My mother looked up once, almost startled to find me standing behind her. There's a folding one outside, by the grill. She said, still sturdy. So I stepped outside, pulled the old folding chair from beside the propane tank, sat with the mosquitoes and the smell of lawnmower oil. From the patio, I could hear Elia laughing through the screen door. Her voice bright, clear, practiced. My glass fogged slightly from the humidity. I wiped it on my sleeve and stared at my reflection. They thought I'd broken, that I'd vanished, that I flunked out of command and faded into nothing. But the truth was quieter. The truth was I'd been recruited the night I resigned. And the war I walked into didn't need uniforms. No one followed me out to the patio. No one brought a plate. No one asked if I needed a refill. That was fine. I didn't come for their food. I sat alone with the propane tank and the rusted grill. The folding chair creaked whenever I shifted. A spider web fluttered beneath the edge of the table, shimmering faintly in the porch light. The smell of scorched iron and old summer clung to the air. Inside, the celebration moved on without interruption. My mother's laughter rose above the clink of dishes. Elia's voice carried effortlessly, narrating a mission story I already knew. She had told it last year on a podcast, and 2 months ago in an interview. The script was polished now. I watched the silhouettes move behind the screen door, plates passed, shoulders touched, laughter lifted, and settled in warm bursts like applause between acts of a play. I took a breath, held it, let it go. They thought I had left service, that I'd flunked out, and folded into civilian life like a failed recipe. What they didn't know, what they never thought to ask, was that I never stopped serving. I just stopped being visible. The division I joined doesn't list ranks. It doesn't host galas. It doesn't throw dinners with cinnamon ham and silver napkin rings. The work is quieter, and the rooms are colder, but the stakes are higher than they've ever imagined. We watch from places without names. We intercept what never makes it into reports. We walk through embassies like ghosts and leave without footprints. They wanted discipline. I gave it, just not to them. I still wore a uniform sometimes, but it didn't have buttons. It had silence, and silence can be sharper than any blade. When I'm debriefed, it's in rooms with no windows. When I speak, every word is transcribed. When I move, it's because a line somewhere turned red, and someone had to act before another domino fell. They talk about command like it's medals and strategy, but real command is knowing how to move before the page is turned. And I have lived in that margin for years now. No headlines, no salutes, just presence, just knowing that if I stopped doing what I do, some of the people sitting inside that house tonight wouldn't even be alive to insult me. I tilted back the chair, looked up at the sky. No stars, too much suburban light. Still, I smiled, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let them underestimate you. Let them laugh. Let them erase you from the photo slideshow. And then, without warning, let the truth walk back in, not to be seen, but to be felt. The folding chair groaned again as I leaned forward. Its legs were uneven, scraping faintly against the concrete. A spot of rust had begun eating through the hinge. I pressed my palm against it, feeling the metal's weakness beneath the skin. Inside, someone toasted Elia's next deployment. Glasses clinked, applause followed. My name never came up, not once. Not even as a joke, not even in passing. It was as if I had never existed. I glanced down at the little paper name cards, laid out neatly on the table through the window. Each seat had a name, a claim, a title. But none for me. Just the chair by the grill, with peeling white paint on one armrest, and the faint scent of lighter fluid still soaked into its fabric. My mother didn't question why I hadn't sat with them. She assumed I knew where I belonged. And maybe I did. Because if they couldn't make space for me now, they certainly never made space for the part of me that stayed behind when I left officer training. They thought I had cracked under pressure, that I had dropped out because I couldn't take the structure, because I lacked follow-through. But the truth was quieter than all their assumptions. I was recruited the night I resigned, not by a therapist, not by a guidance officer, but by someone who handed me a file without a logo and said, "We've been watching. You see what others are told to ignore." And I did. That was the night I stopped being a problem and started being a solution no one could acknowledge. While Elia was walking the stage for public command, I was walking into basements 3 stories below embassies, into secure briefings where names weren't spoken, only code. While they sent her medals in velvet boxes, they sent me clearance in invisible corridors. And that was fine, because I had no use for trophies. I already knew what I was worth, and I didn't need their seat, not when I had my own ground to stand on. From the patio, I heard someone inside bring up childhood stories. Laughter again, something about Elia winning a spelling bee in 7th grade, a proud moment, a perfect narrative. I remembered that day differently. I remembered being the one who gave her the word list, who stayed up quizzing her while she cried from the pressure. But none of that made it into the story. It never does. Not when you're the scaffolding, not the spotlight. I took a deep breath and let the night settle on my shoulders like a weight I had long since learned to carry. No photos, no seat, no name card, no need. Because the work I do doesn't require permission. It requires precision. We didn't wear patches. We didn't have ranks or uniforms or plaques on marble walls. We had clearance and silence. The Sable program wasn't listed anywhere official. It didn't exist in documents you could FOIA. It didn't brief the press. No unit number. No motto. Just a name passed between closed lips in underground corridors. We weren't the ones who flew the drones. We were the ones who decided where they didn't need to fly. It wasn't espionage in the Hollywood sense. No trench coats, no cyanide capsules. It was presence, placed precisely, removed without trace. My induction wasn't celebrated. It was tested. They put me in front of a desk with 3 redacted files and asked one question. Which one of these is lying? I knew within 9 minutes. They didn't smile. They just handed me a second file, then a third, then a new identity, then a new silence. They taught me how to vanish without leaving a vacuum, how to shift digital records just enough to raise flags where needed, and hide where not. I learned how to breathe inside walls, to sit in negotiations, knowing every lie before it landed, to plant a suggestion so gently a senator would think it was his idea. We didn't run operations. We bent them from the shadows. And when something went wrong, when a diplomat crossed a line, when a contractor went dark, we went in, not to arrest, but to recalibrate. Elia was praised for her logistical precision in Arctic deployment, but I was the one who restructured the entire food chain in that region. Because one missing cargo manifest wasn't a mistake. It was a warning. The wrong people were starting to trace our presence, and I was sent to clean it. From the outside, I was still a dropout, still a footnote, still a disappointment. But from the inside, I was the contingency, the protocol that got activated when everything else failed. I never got a medal, but I got something better. Access. The kind of access that doesn't expire. That doesn't belong to rank. That doesn't get revoked after a scandal. I wrote strategy for situations that weren't supposed to happen, designed fallback plans for entire regions, neutralized threats before they made it onto radar. The work wasn't glorious, but it was necessary. And it was mine. I wasn't lost. I wasn't broken. I wasn't invisible. I was embedded. Not in uniform, but in the spaces uniform never reached. And for the first time in years, I felt something shift. Not outside. Inside. A quiet certainty that the girl they erased had become the woman they would never see coming. The alert came at 3:12 am. One sharp vibration against the nightstand. No sound. No warning. Just a single pulse through the encrypted channel I hadn't touched in months. I sat up instantly. No confusion. No hesitation. I knew what it was. I reached for the device beneath my bed frame. A pocket drive, modified for off-grid pings. It only activated under one condition: unauthorized access to a file that shouldn't exist, by someone who shouldn't know it was there. Only 2 fingerprints in the world could open that drive. Mine and Aaliyah's. She had found it, the one I slipped into her duffel bag last Christmas, hidden inside a protein bar wrapper, labeled with a barcode no scanner could decode, just subtle enough not to look important, just obvious enough to tempt curiosity. I had left it for her, not to spy, but to see when the story she thought she was living began to split at the seams. I opened the terminal. The ping came from within Fort Griffin's firewall. Time-stamped, logged, cross-referenced. She hadn't just opened it. She had tried to copy it. I stared at the logs for a long moment. Not angry, not surprised, just still, because this meant 2 things. 1, she had found the file. 2, she had no idea what she had just activated. That drive didn't hold secrets. It held triggers, not destructive, informational. It would have led her to a name, a single code name embedded in a training video metadata. Vassal. To anyone else, just an oversight, an old system glitch. But to me, it was a signature, a ghost, resurfaced. I had buried that name 3 years ago, after a mission that never got debriefed, a name tied to a breach I had barely sealed in time. And now, Elia had found it, without knowing what she had walked into. I opened the backup logs, confirmed the echo. It wasn't a fluke. The file had been accessed from her location, by her account, at a time when no one else should have been awake. She was digging, or being led to dig. And that meant only one thing. Someone was baiting her to get to me. I sat back, let the silence of the room settle around me like a second skin. The game had restarted. But this time, it wasn't in my control. I reached for the comm line, typed a single message. To Decker, level 4 ping confirmed. Sable Wing, noon. Then I stood, packed nothing, left the room just as it was, because this wasn't a mission anymore. This was family, and that changes everything. The Sable Wing was buried 4 levels beneath Fort Griffin. No windows, no nameplate, no echoes, just sterile light, neutral walls, and a temperature calibrated to erase comfort. Elia was escorted in at exactly noon. She walked like she still carried her rank. Spine locked, steps sharp, face unreadable. But when she saw me, her eyes betrayed her. She froze for less than a second. But enough. I stood beside Decker, his arms crossed, his face unreadable as stone. "Sit," I said. Not a question, not a request. She sat, her fingers tensed over her knees, muscles coiled like she hadn't decided whether she was in a debrief or an ambush. I placed the drive on the table between us, the one she'd opened. "You accessed a file that doesn't exist in public records," I said. "That ping could have compromised active agents across 5 continents." She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "I didn't mean to." "I know." I cut in. "But that doesn't undo it." Decker said nothing. His silence was its own pressure. Elia looked at me then, not as a sister, but as something else, something she wasn't sure how to define. "Are you really?" "This?" she asked. I didn't answer. She looked down at the drive, then back up. Her voice cracked just slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" I stared at her for a long moment, let the weight of everything she never saw sit between us. "Because you never asked," I said. It wasn't accusation. It was fact. She thought I had disappeared. She thought I had failed. She never once thought I had risen somewhere she couldn't see. I slid a second file across the table. "Do you recognize this name?" As she looked, brows furrowed. "T. Vassal." Recognition flickered. She nodded slowly. "He was in a logistics simulator protocol. Years ago, got pulled for misconduct. That's the official story," I said. "The unofficial one is still unfolding." She leaned back, processing, connecting dots she didn't know were even part of the same puzzle. "You think he planted something in the system?" "In my unit, I don't think." I said. "I know." Her breath caught, and that was the first time. She looked afraid, not of me, of what she might have let in. I watched her, watched the moment the weight shifted. The certainty cracked. The uniform slipped, not in appearance, in identity. Because once you know you've been used, you never see your role the same again. I stood. "This doesn't go to court," I said. "This doesn't go to records. This goes to pattern recognition." Decker stepped forward, pulled up the access logs, lines of code, timestamps, user IDs, a trail of silent betrayals. And Aaliyah, now part of it, not as a villain, but as a hinge in a door someone else had forced open. And I had just stepped through. The room dimmed as the logs flickered onto the wall. A stream of code poured down like rain, clean on the surface, deceptive underneath. Decker scrolled without speaking. Elia sat forward now, no longer the one in command, but the one watching the floor disappear beneath her. I moved to the terminal, hands steady, eyes sharp. We weren't looking for a name. Names can be changed. We were looking for rhythm, and rhythm is harder to fake. Every system breach has a fingerprint, a tempo, a hesitation where confidence hides. I searched by delay packets, not usernames, the milliseconds between keystrokes. That's where intent lives. Elia leaned in beside me, watching the script unfold line by line. Then I saw it, a fragment buried beneath a fake archive, logged as a system timeout. But inside it, a shell signature. T. Vassal. It pulsed once on screen, like a scar beneath new skin. Elia whispered it, like a name from a ghost story. "He's supposed to be gone." "He never left," I said. "He just changed where he hides." 3 years ago, Vassal had been pulled from strategy rotation. They said he altered mission simulators, introduced data chaos into predictive modeling. They said he'd gone rogue. But no court-martial, no public file, no press release, just vanished. Now here he was, using Elia's access to reach into the system I built, and bend it, not to destroy, to frame. Decker folded his arms, his voice low. "He's baiting a shadow strike, trying to hang the breach on you, Commander." I nodded. Slowly. He's counting on Ilya being the crack. On her reputation, keeping me out of the room long enough for him to finish rewriting history. Ilya's hands clenched on her knees. She stared at the signature, like it would blink first. I didn't know, she said. Voice soft. Ra. I know, I said. And this time, it wasn't cold, because I believed her. She didn't bring the breach. She just carried it. Unwitting, but still dangerous. We pulled the chain backward. Link by link. Fake directories. Misnamed files. Reassigned timestamps. And behind all of it, the same steady pattern. Like footsteps returning to a locked door. He's trying to alter Mothline records, I said. And that stopped the room. Decker turned. Even his face lost its composure for a second. Jesus. That op sealed. Exactly. And if he rewrites the civilian incident log, then it's your voice that gets buried. I tapped the last line of code, brought up the original audio file. Static at first. Then my own voice. Hold fire. Possible presence. Confirm first. Ilya looked at me. Eyes wider now. Then at the timestamp. This was never in the report, because he erased it before it reached the board. I played it again, then showed the override key. His key. Vassals. And just like that, the frame collapsed. Ilya looked down. Not in shame, but in understanding. He used me to get to you. I nodded, because no one ever sees what's standing just outside the spotlight. And now, the spotlight was about to shift. The chamber echoed like a vault. No windows. No emblems. Just walls that swallowed sound and watched everything. 3 chairs at the front. Black suits. No name tags. No insignia. Just eyes. Vassal stood before them with the stillness of a man who believed the lie he told long enough to make it truth. His hands were folded neatly. His voice was precise. His words came packaged in authority. This shows Commander Arlen failed to report a civilian incident during Operation Mothline. He held the redacted file like a gavel. Like a weapon. Like a coffin. I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached into the folder in front of me, pulled a single sheet, the original directive, signed by him, timestamped the night before the op, his own order to proceed despite flagged civilian presence. Then I played the audio. My voice. Measured. Firm. Hold fire. Possible presence. Confirm first. Silence followed. Sharp. Absolute. Ilya stepped forward without prompting. She held the breach log. Her hand didn't shake. She spoke not as sister, but as soldier. He altered timestamps. He masked the directive. He tried to rewrite what really happened. She handed the log to the council, then looked at Vassal. And for the first time, he blinked. Just once. The panel didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence had shifted. It wasn't the silence of doubt, or the silence of dismissal. It was the silence that follows the truth, when there's nothing left to deny. Vassal's mouth opened. Closed. No words came. I watched him, this man who once tried to bury my voice, now watching his own get choked by evidence. Decker stood at the back, arms crossed, expression unreadable, but he nodded once. Barely. A fraction of approval, only the quiet notice. The panel leaned, files shuffled. He's clicked. Then came the verdict. Soft. Final. You are cleared. Rank restored. Inquiry closed. I didn't smile. Justice isn't about celebration. It's about balance being returned, even when no one cheers. Vassal was dismissed. No eye contact. No farewell. Just erased. The way he tried to do to me. Later, outside the chamber, Ilya waited by the elevator. Her ribbons gone. Her stance quieter. She looked at me with a new kind of weight. Not shame. Not pity. Recognition. I didn't want to wear this, she said, holding the silver badge. The sable insignia. I want to earn it. She placed it in my hand. I will. I looked at her, saw not the sister who once left me outside with a folding chair, but the woman who had finally stepped into the room. Then start here, I said, and turned toward the lift, because justice had landed. But the story wasn't finished yet. The airfield was quiet by dusk. Runway lights blinked in soft rhythm. like Morse code for those who had nowhere left to land. My boots echoed softly on the tarmac, each step deliberate, each silence earned. They had offered me a press statement, a reinstatement ceremony, a citation. I declined all three, not out of bitterness, but because silence was still where I spoke best. The jet behind me hummed in standby, a symbol of return, or escape, or both. I stood at its edge, watching the sun settle behind the distant hangars, the sky cut between crimson and steel. I heard her footsteps before I saw her. Aaliyah. No medals, no ribbons, no fanfare, just a black field jacket, and in her hand, a single badge. Silver, unworn. She stopped beside me, didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. We stood like that for a while, two shadows drawn long across the concrete. No longer mirror images, but parallel lines finally realigned. Then she held the badge out to me, palm open, eyes steady. "I don't want to wear this," she said, her voice quieter than usual, almost reverent. "I want to earn it." I looked down at the insignia that meant nothing to the world, but everything to those who moved it without leaving footprints. She wasn't asking for approval. She was offering accountability, and that mattered. I reached out, closed her fingers around the badge. "Then start here," I said. Simple, soft, not as command, but as invitation. She nodded. Once, we didn't hug, didn't cry, didn't promise to fix everything. Some relationships aren't rebuilt with words. They're rewritten through presence. As she turned to leave, she paused, just briefly. "Next time there's dinner," she said, "I'll set a chair with your name on it." I said nothing, because she finally understood. It was never about the chair. It was about who notices when you've always been standing. The jet lifted off without ceremony. No salutes, no cameras, just dusk folding gently around the wings as it rose. I looked out the window, down at Fort Griffin, the base bathed in twilight, runways glowing like arteries of some quiet, breathing creature. They still wouldn't speak of me. Not in their records, not in their ceremonies, not even in their whispered stories. To them, I would remain the dropout, the one who couldn't follow orders, the one who left, but somewhere inside that base, 4 levels down, behind a terminal with no keyboard, there was now a folder, and on that folder was my name, not in gold, not engraved, but typed in code only 5 people in the world could read. And that was enough, because that file didn't list my failures. It held my protocols, my decisions, the blueprints I left behind, not just for the next threat, but for the next mind brave enough to think outside rank. Elia would find it someday. Maybe not now. Maybe not until she forgot who she had once been taught I was. But she'd see the shape of me, not in the photos, but in the framework. And maybe then, she'd understand that I never wanted legacy. I wanted leverage, not over people, over systems, to make the structure just a little more honest, a little more aware of the ones it forgets too easily. I leaned back in my seat, closed my eyes, let the engine hum fold into silence. Outside, the world kept moving, oblivious to the echo I had become. And that was fine, because the loudest truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to endure. And I endured, not to be remembered, but to leave something behind. That couldn't be erased, not even by silence,